My daughter texted me 2 words I had not seen since the night Margaret passed away, blue porch light. I was standing in my kitchen in Cedar Rapids, one hand on a grocery bag, the other still wet from the rain. The house smelled like coffee old wood and the lemon soap Claire used when she was little and believed every storm could be made smaller if the lights stayed on. I stared at the screen longer than I should have because I knew that phrase. Claire and I had made it after Margaret died. If she ever needed me and could not say it out loud, she would send blue porch light. I did not answer right away. I walked to the front window instead and looked at the street, half expecting to see headlights stop in front of the house. The driveway was empty. The porch light was on. The blue bulb I had changed for Claire last fall glowed through the rain, like a warning only I could read. Then my phone rang. It was Claire. I almost answered it, but I heard Mason before I saw him. His voice was low, too calm, the kind of calm that meant he was trying to sound certain of something he was not certain about at all. "By Monday, your father's house is ours," he said from the kitchen. I stood so still I could hear the refrigerator motor click on behind me. Claire made a small sound, almost a breath, almost a protest, and then Mason lowered his voice again. "The buyer does not care how we get there. He only cares that the title is clean." Title, buyer, Monday. My fingers tightened around the phone until the edges dug into my palm. I did not walk into that kitchen. I did not slam the door. I did not give Mason the satisfaction of watching me unravel. I opened the voice recorder on my phone, instead slipped it into my shirt pocket and let my breathing slow down till it sounded like nothing had changed at all. That was the first lesson Mason never understood about me. When I get angry, I do not get loud. I get careful. Claire's text still glowed on the screen blue porch light, and now I understood why she had sent it. She was not asking me to come. She was asking me to come quietly. So I did. And when I took the first step toward the kitchen, I already knew I was walking into the kind of night that either saved a family or split it apart forever. I stood outside the kitchen door for one more breath and listened to Mason keep talking as if he owned the air in the room. "We do not need drama," he said. "We need signatures. We need the doctor letter. We need Frank relaxed enough to think this is a care plan, not a takeover." Care plan. The words felt neat and clean in his mouth, like he had polished them for days. I stayed in the hallway and watched the shadow of Claire's hand move across the table, through the frosted glass in the door. She was there. I could picture the way she would be sitting, too straight, one knee bouncing fingers, locked around the edge of a mug she was not drinking from. That was how she looked when she was trying not to cry in front of anyone who had taught her the tears were weakness. Mason went on. "The buyer already has the bank draft ready. Once the title search comes back clear, we schedule the transfer Monday morning, and it is done. Monday morning. Not someday. Not eventually. Monday." My mind moved fast, but my body stayed still. I was 67, not stupid. I knew exactly what a deadline like that meant. Mason had not built a plan for one conversation. He had built a clock. Every time he said Monday, he was trying to make the date feel bigger than my judgment. I pulled my phone out again and checked the screen. Claire's message still sat there like a flare in the dark. Blue porch light. It made a memory rise so sharply I almost lost my breath. Years ago, when Claire was 10, a tornado warning had trapped us in the basement with a battery radio, 2 flashlights, and Margaret reading to us in a voice that never shook, no matter how hard the wind pressed against the house. Claire had invented the code that night. If she was afraid and could not explain why she would ask for the blue porch light, it was our way of saying, "Come now, but do not scare me more than I already am." I lifted my hand toward the door, then stopped. Mason's voice dropped lower. "Frank will sign if he thinks he has to," he said. "He wants to help. He always does." That was the part that burned. Not because he was right. Because he had watched me long enough to know I would help the people I loved even when it cost me. He was not just lying about my mind. He was counting on my kindness. So I gave him none of it. I backed away from the kitchen and went to the dining room, where the curtains hid most of the window light. I wrote one line in my notebook, Monday transfer buyer ready title search. Then I put the notebook in my coat pocket and stood there a moment longer, listening to Mason keep talking inside the room, like a man who had not yet realized the room had already begun to turn against him. What he did not know was that I had spent my whole life learning how to wait for a storm to pass. The blue porch light took me back before it pushed me forward. Claire was 11 the first time she used it. Margaret had passed away 6 months earlier, and our house had become too quiet in places where grief likes to sit and pretend it is furniture. Claire would not ask for help directly. She would carry her fear like a heavy school bag, set it down at the edge of the room, and hope I noticed the way her shoulders tightened. One night, a bad storm rolled over the city. The power blinked twice. Claire stood in the doorway of the kitchen with her blanket wrapped around her shoulders and whispered, "If I say blue porch light, you come find me." I told her I always would. That was the promise Mason was trying to turn into a weakness. I had built too much of my life around being useful. When Margaret was alive, that had been easy. She saw the good in it. She knew I repaired things, because I loved seeing people safe inside them. After she died, Claire inherited that part of me and learned how to pull on it without meaning to. She would call when Lily needed a ride when a fuse blew, when a bill was confusing, when she just wanted me at the house, because she hated how quiet it felt without her mother there. I never complained. Maybe that was my mistake. A man who never says no starts to look like a door that never locks. I sat at the kitchen table after Mason and Claire went quiet, and the old memory came back in pieces, the storm radio hissing in the basement. Margaret's hand on Claire's hair, the three of us pretending the wind was not as loud as it was. That was when Claire learned codes were safer than speeches. A code meant fear had become too large for ordinary words. Now Claire was using the same code again, not because of weather, because of Mason. The realization sat in my chest like a stone. It did not excuse her silence, but it changed how I saw it. A daughter does not send a childhood code unless something in her life has become frightening enough to make her reach backward for the oldest safe thing she knows. I heard the kitchen chair scrape, then silence. I should have walked in then. I should have put my hand on the table and asked Claire what was happening while Mason was still trying to sound like a reasonable man. But I knew Mason. If I moved too fast, he would turn everything into a crisis about my temper. He would say I was confused, emotional, unsteady. He would wrap my anger around my own throat and call it proof. So I did what I had never once thought of as heroic. I waited. I wrote down the code. I wrote down Monday. I wrote down buyer. I wrote down trust. Then I leaned back in my chair and let the silence do some work for me. If Mason wanted to think he had the advantage, he would have to keep talking. Men like him always did eventually. They cannot stand a room that does not agree with them. And I was beginning to suspect that Claire had not sent me the code to ask for rescue. She had sent it because she wanted me to hear something. By the time I walked back toward the kitchen, the door was open and the room had gone quiet in that dangerous way that means everybody is pretending to be calmer than they are. Claire was standing at the counter with both hands flat on the wood. Mason was by the window, one finger tapping against his phone. On the table between them sat a folder I had never seen before, thick enough to be important and pale enough to be fake. I nodded at it. "What is that?" Mason smiled first. He always did when he wanted a lie to wear a friendly face. "Temporary care paperwork," he said. "Just a safety measure in case your fall gets worse." I looked at Claire. "And you?" Her eyes flicked to Mason and back again. He said it would only help if there was an emergency. Emergency! Another neat word. Another clean wrapper. I opened the folder slowly. Pages of typed language stared back at me with my name printed in places where my name had not been written by my own hand. There was a doctor draft unsigned, a note about decision support, a form that would have let someone speak for me if I was unable to manage daily matters. The wording was careful enough to sound respectful and blunt enough to take the wind out of a person's own authority. I recognized the trap before I finished the second page. Mason was not trying to prove I was lost. He was trying to make me doubt whether I should fight him if he said I was. "Where did this come from?" I asked. "A template," Mason said. Claire and I just wanted something ready. If anything happened, we would not be scrambling. Claire said nothing. That silence told me enough. I closed the folder and set it back on the table. If this is only a safety measure, then why does it include my building? Mason's face did not change much, but his jaw shifted once. That tiny movement mattered. He had thought I would skim, not read. He had thought the authority of paper would scare me more than the people who wrote it. The building is part of the trust, he said. The buyer is interested in the property. We need flexibility. There was the truth, or enough of it to show the shape. Claire's hand moved to the folder edge as if she wanted to push it away and could not quite manage it. I saw the tremor in her fingers before she tucked them under her other hand. She was scared. Not of me. Of what would happen if she admitted she had already let Mason steer this far. I felt anger rise then settle. Anger would not help me read, so I read every page and memorized the parts that mattered, who drafted it, who had seen it, what the signature line tried to imitate, and how carefully Mason had chosen words that sounded kind, while quietly handing him the wheel. When I looked up, Mason was watching me with the expression of a man waiting to see whether a locked door had just become easier to open. He had no idea I had already called someone who knew the difference between paperwork and a plan. And he had even less idea that Claire's silence was starting to crack. Mason made his next mistake before he knew I was listening for it. He stepped into the hallway, lowered his voice, and called someone back from the edge of the kitchen where he thought the walls would protect him. Yes, the title review is the only thing left, he said. No, Frank will not be a problem if Claire keeps him calm. We should still be able to close Monday morning. Close. That was the word he loved most. It made stealing sound like order. I stayed near the dining room archway and let him keep talking. He did not know I was close enough to hear the paper rustle in his hand when he shifted the phone to his other ear. He sounded different now, less polished, more anxious. The smooth voice he used with Claire thinned out when he talked to the buyer. There was a hunger under it, and I could hear it better than I wanted to. He needed the sale, not for the house, for himself. That changed everything. When he returned to the kitchen, he found me at the table with the folder closed and my notebook open beside it. Mason, I said, who is buying the property. He gave a small laugh that did not reach his eyes. A local investor. Nothing you need to worry about. Then you will not mind telling me his name. He looked at Claire first. She looked at the floor. That told me the buyer was not a detail. It was leverage. He was using someone else's money to make the rest of the lie feel urgent. If I could learn who that buyer was, I could learn how much Mason had already promised and how much room he had left to lie. So I asked again, quieter this time. What exactly do you need from me before Monday? Mason held my stare for one breath too long. Then his face softened in a way I had seen before. It was the face men like him wear when they are about to tell you something meant to sound generous and actually means the opposite. We just need you to trust us, Frank, he said. That is all. Trust. I looked at Claire when he said it. Her eyes shimmered, but she still would not speak. She was trapped between the man she had married and the father she knew could still pull the whole thing apart if she told the truth. I could see her fighting herself. That was the part Mason did not understand. He thought silence always belonged to him. Sometimes silence is just fear waiting for the right shape. I pushed my notebook toward me and wrote one more line. Buyer exists, Mason anxious. Then I shut the book and stood up. I do trust people, I said. I just trust evidence more. Mason's smile disappeared for half a second. That half second was enough for me to know the buyer was real, the deadline was real, and the thing Mason feared most was not me losing my temper. It was me finding the paper trail before Monday did. The next morning I took the raincoat out of the closet and found the binder Margaret had asked me to keep in the hall cabinet years ago. She had labeled it in her careful handwriting, "If something happens." I remember laughing when she first made it. Margaret had always believed preparation was a form of love. She kept extra batteries in the junk drawer, replacement keys in a jar above the fridge, and a list of phone numbers taped inside the pantry door where nobody else would think to look. The binder had felt dramatic then. After she passed away, it became one of the few things in the house that still sounded like her. I sat at the dining table with the binder open and the window light falling across the pages. There were insurance sheets, account notes, copies of deeds, medical contacts, and a trust addendum tucked into the back sleeve. That was the page I wanted. Daniel Cho had drafted it with Margaret and me after we talked about how quickly family pressure can change shape once money sits in the room. The addendum was simple. Lily's future could not be rushed away just because an adult wanted control before she was old enough to understand why it mattered. It was not written like a threat. It was written like a fence. I heard the front door open before I heard Claire's footsteps. She stopped in the doorway when she saw the binder spread across the table. For a second, she looked like a little girl again, the kind who had once made a fort out of couch cushions and asked me whether a person could still feel safe after the lights went out. "Where did that come from?" she asked. "Your mother." That answer made her face tighten. Claire knew exactly what I meant. Margaret had always seen more than she said. She would have hated what Mason was doing, but she would have hated even more the way Claire had let fear make choices for her. Claire sat down across from me, but not too close. I kept my voice level. "Did Mason show you this before he brought it to me?" She did not answer. That was answer enough. I closed the trust addendum and tapped the edge of the page. "Claire, if Mason told you this was only a safety plan, then why is he trying to move the house before Monday?" Her eyes filled so quickly it almost startled me. "Because he said if we wait, the buyer walks away." There it was. Not greed alone. Panic. Mason was afraid the whole thing would collapse if he lost momentum. He had found a buyer with money, but not enough patience. That told me his bluff had edges. It also told me Claire was not standing beside him because she wanted to hurt me. She was standing there because every time he sounded cornered, she mistook control for survival. I softened, but only a little. "Claire," I said, "I am not asking you to pick a side before you know what side you are on." She shut her eyes for 1 second. When she opened them, she looked smaller than she had in years. "I do not know how to stop him," she whispered. I believed her, not because I excused her, because I knew that tone. It was the tone of a person who has spent too long saying yes in order to avoid the look that comes after no. I took out a fresh legal pad and wrote 4 words: buyer title, doctor form, bank. "Then do not stop him today," I said. "Help me understand him instead." Claire looked at the page, then at the binder, then at the window, as though the answer might be outside the house. The rain had stopped leaving the street shiny and empty. She rubbed her thumb over the side of her mug and finally gave me the first small truth she had offered all week. He said, "If the title search fails, we lose everything." That was the phrase I needed. Lose everything. Not lose an argument. Lose everything. Now I knew exactly how much fear Mason was carrying and exactly how far he might go before Monday arrived. Daniel Cho did not come to the house like a man bringing rescue. He came carrying a leather portfolio under one arm, his coat still damp from the drive, his glasses fogged from the cold. That was one of the reasons I trusted him. Daniel never entered a room trying to dominate it. He observed first. He let the room tell him what kind of problem it was. He set the portfolio on the table, looked at the binder, and said, "Frank, you were right to wait." That was all he said at first. No speech, no dramatics. Just those 6 words, and the air in my chest eased enough to let me breathe normally again. Claire stayed near the counter while Daniel looked through the papers. Mason was not there yet. For once, the house gave us a small mercy. Daniel read the doctor draft twice, his mouth flattening at the corners. "This is not something anyone should sign in a hurry," he said. "Not if the person signing is clear and able to make decisions." I nodded. That's what I thought. He looked at me over the top of his glasses. "Then you also know why he kept saying Monday." I did. Timing. Pressure. A closing window. A chance to make a lie feel like the last reasonable option. Daniel folded his hands. "I need to be careful here. I cannot tell you to confront Mason at random, and I cannot tell you what any outside office would do. But I can tell you this documentation matters more than emotion right now." I almost smiled. Emotion had gotten me through marriage grief and 40 years of work. But emotion was not the tool for this particular job. Daniel asked if I had recorded the hallway conversation. I handed him my phone. He listened once, then again. He did not flinch. That was another thing I liked about him. Some people hear danger and start performing intelligence. Daniel heard danger and started organizing it. Good, he said at last. Keep everything. Dates, names, times. If Mason has been collecting drafts, keep copies. If Claire sends you messages, keep those too. Do not argue about every sentence. Let the pattern do the talking. I glanced at Claire. Her shoulders had curled inward, but she was listening hard now. Daniel turned to her gently. Claire, if you signed anything because you felt cornered, tell your father what happened now, not later. She pressed her palms together. I did not sign the final version. The final version. Not the first draft. Not the one meant to sound harmless. The final version. My jaw tightened, but I kept my voice even. Did Mason ask you to? Claire stared at the binder instead of me. He said it would protect Lily if your memory got worse. That sentence landed like cold water. Not because it was new, because it was efficient. He had taken a fear every daughter understands and folded it around my name like a blanket with a hidden hook inside. Daniel wrote something in his notebook. That is the kind of thing we do not answer with a fight in the kitchen. Then how do we answer it, I asked. He looked at the phone in my hand, then at the binder, then at Claire. With a record Mason cannot explain away. I liked that answer too much, because it meant Mason still thought this was a story about who could speak the loudest. It was not. It was becoming a story about who could prove what happened when no one was pretending anymore. Claire waited until Daniel went to his car before she said anything else. She stood in the doorway with her arms wrapped around herself, staring at the damp driveway like she expected it to answer for her. That was how fear lived in her these days. It made her look out before she looked in. It made her listen for someone else's mood before she listened to her own. Dad, she said, and then stopped. I did not rush her. I had learned long ago that some truths only come out if the room is patient enough to deserve them. She took one breath. Mason's not trying to hurt you. I let that sit there. Then she shook her head, almost angry with herself. That's not what I mean. I mean, he is scared. He thinks if he loses this sale, he loses the business. And if he loses the business, he loses everything. He says he is only trying to keep us safe. Us. That was the first time she had included herself in his fear instead of his plan. I stepped closer to the doorway, still careful not to crowd her. And what do you think? Her laugh came out thin and broken. I think I do not know where his fear ends and mine begins anymore. That was the most honest thing she had said in weeks, and it hurt to hear because I knew what it cost her to say it out loud. She wiped her eyes with the heel of her hand. He told me if I hesitated, the buyer would leave. He said your trust rules were built for a different kind of family, one that had time to be patient. There it was again, a neat sentence with a cruel little point hidden inside it. I felt the urge to defend Margaret's choices, to trust my own judgment, all of it. But Claire was not attacking me. She was confessing how Mason had trained her to think guilt was the same thing as loyalty. Did you believe him? I asked. She looked ashamed, which told me the answer had been yes, at least partly. I believed him enough to stop asking questions. I nodded once. That was the first crack in the wall. Not because she suddenly became brave, because she admitted the shape of the wall in the first place. I told her what Daniel had said. Keep records, keep messages. Do not argue with the performance. Claire swallowed hard. He checks my phone sometimes. That was the second thing I needed to know. Not because I wanted to pry, but because control always leaves fingerprints. If Mason was checking her phone, then he was not just asking for trust. He was policing her reality. I held out my hand. Then send me what you can now. Her face changed. Relief, fear, shame, all of it crossing one after another like weather over water. She pulled up her messages and began forwarding them to me one by one. Short pieces, half sentences. Mason saying the doctor draft needed a quick signature. Mason saying Lily should not worry about the house. Mason saying I was too old to carry this alone. Mason saying the buyer had already made room for us. Each message carried its own pressure. None of them looked terrible alone. Together they looked planned. Claire gave me the phone back with shaking hands. "I am sorry," she whispered. I wanted to tell her that apology was not the same as repair. But I also saw the girl who once ran to me in a storm, because she trusted my voice more than the thunder. So I said the only true thing I had left. "Then help me make it right before he knows we are awake." Her breath caught, and from the other side of the street, as if the night had been waiting to answer, Mason's car rolled slowly into the driveway. I had the recorder running before Mason shut his car door, not because I expected a confession, because I had finally stopped expecting truth to arrive dressed like truth. People like Mason tell on themselves in motion more than in words. They cannot help it. The pressure makes them reach for whatever sentence will keep the room from looking directly at them. He came in with the kind of smile men use when they have already decided the hard part is over. "Frank," he said, clapping me lightly on the shoulder, before he remembered I was not pretending with him any more. "I am glad we can be practical about this." Practical. He loved that word, too. Claire stood near the sink. She did not look at him. That alone changed the temperature in the room. Mason set his keys on the counter and opened his hands, as if the gesture itself proved good intentions. "The buyer is nervous, so I need to keep Monday clean. If the trust paperwork gets delayed again, he may walk." I asked again. He blinked once. "Just once, but I saw it." "We have been working on the language," he said. "Nothing unusual." Claire's fingers curled around the back of a chair. I could tell she wanted to speak and was deciding whether the cost would be worse than the silence. Mason kept going, and that was the gift. Men who think they are in control often become generous with explanation when they start feeling watched. "Your father does not need the stress," he told Claire. "You told me he has been forgetful. We only want to protect him." There it was, not a lie, a shapeshift. He was taking my age, my grief, my normal human moments of forgetting where I put my glasses, and turning them into a story where I no longer had to be trusted with my own name. I looked at Claire. She stared at the floor. Mason mistook that for agreement. "See," he said. "Even she understands we are trying to do this the right way." "The right way," I repeated. He smiled as if we were finally talking man to man. "Yes, the responsible way." I held up my phone. "Then say that again." His smile flickered. "What?" "Say it again," I said, slowly. "If this is the responsible way, I want you to hear yourself on the record." The room went still. That was when Mason's face changed for the first time. Not fear yet. Something narrower. Annoyance, maybe. The expression of a man who realizes the furniture is no longer arranged where he left it. He laughed once, but the sound was brittle. "You think this is some kind of trap?" I did not answer, because he had just given me another piece of the truth without meaning to. He did not say no. He did not say I was mistaken. He asked whether I thought it was a trap. That meant he understood the shape of one. I checked the recorder, then tucked my phone back in my pocket. Mason looked from me to Claire and back again. His eyes sharpened, and for the first time he seemed to understand that the room was not his to direct any more. I could almost see him recalculating, and that was exactly what I wanted. The call from the bank came while Mason was in the bathroom, and Claire was pretending not to watch the clock. I answered in the dining room, one hand on the back of the chair, because I knew from the tone of the woman on the line that this was not a routine courtesy call. Her name was Teresa, and she sounded like someone who had already checked 3 things before she picked up the phone. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "I wanted to let you know we received an inquiry about access tied to your accounts." I did not interrupt. Teresa continued. "The person asked about what would happen if a spouse or family member needed temporary authority because of a medical concern. I am not authorized to discuss account details, but I can tell you the inquiry was recent, and it did not come from you." I thanked her and asked her to send whatever notice she could in writing. That was enough to tell me Mason's reach was not stopping at the table. When I hung up, the house felt colder. Not because of the weather, because the shape of the plan had widened. I wrote 3 words on the legal pad: accounts, authority, timing. Claire saw my face and knew something had changed. "What?" "Someone has been asking questions at the bank." Her hand flew to her mouth. It was not surprise exactly. It was the look of a person who recognizes the sound of a door opening behind her, but still hopes it belongs to someone else. I told her only what mattered. They asked about what happens if a family member needs temporary authority. She went pale. That told me Mason had moved from the trust to the accounts. He was not just trying to sell the building. He was building a second path in case the first one slowed down. That is what frightened me most. Not the lie itself, but the patience underneath it. Claire sat down hard enough that the chair legs squealed. He said he was only making sure bills do not get missed, she whispered. I looked towards the hallway because I could hear Mason moving around in the bathroom, humming to himself. A small sound, so ordinary it made my skin prickle. Monsters always have ordinary habits. That is part of why people do not notice them right away. I lowered my voice. Claire did. He asked you to call the bank? She hesitated. That hesitation answered the question. No more than that. I did not need the whole story yet. I needed the direction of the wind. Then I heard a small knock from the front window. It was Lily. She had come to the glass with her school backpack still on one shoulder, and she was looking at me with that serious little face children get when they are trying to be brave for the adults around them. I opened the door. She held out a folded piece of paper. Dad said to give you this if you got confused. My stomach dropped. I took the note and unfolded it slowly. Inside was a single line in Mason's handwriting. Remember, Frank gets mixed up sometimes. Keep him calm. Not for the first time I felt the room tilt, because now I knew the bank inquiry was only one layer deeper, and Lily had just handed me proof that Mason was teaching my granddaughter how to help him shape my reality. And once a child starts repeating your fear for someone else's benefit, you are already too late if you still think this is a small problem. Lily stood outside the front window, with the folded note still in my hand, her backpack slung too low on one shoulder, and her curls damp from the rain that had started again while I was on the phone. She looked at me with a kind of caution no 9-year-old should have to learn. I opened the door only halfway and knelt so we were eye level. Who told you to give me this? She glanced toward the driveway. Mason. She did not say his name, but she did not need to. Instead, she whispered, he said, if you get mixed up, I should remind you to stay calm. The words landed hard, not because Lily said them, because she said them like she had practiced. I took the backpack from her shoulder and set it on the chair by the entryway. Sweetheart, when did he tell you that? She picked at a loose thread on her sleeve. This morning. He said the blue porch light means you worry, and worrying makes people forget things. That was Mason's real mistake. He had not only gone after my trust, he had gone after Lily's memory of me. He wanted her to see me through his fear, not through her own eyes. I felt something in me go very still. Did he ask you to say anything else? I asked. Lily looked confused for a second, then shook her head. He said to tell you that the house is safer if it gets managed by grown-ups. Managed. That word again. It sounded harmless to a child. It sounded like a lid on a box. To me, it sounded like a warning that Mason was teaching her to help him rename what he wanted. I touched the edge of her backpack. You did the right thing by bringing me the note. Her face lifted just a little. Children know when they are being trusted. It changes them. It made Lily stand straighter, like she had just been given back a piece of her own voice. Inside, Claire was watching us through the glass. Her hand rose halfway, then fell. She wanted to come closer. She was afraid to. I asked Lily, did Mason say why he wanted me calm? Because Monday is important. Important. That was the word Mason used when he wanted a child to carry an adult burden without knowing it. I thanked Lily and gave her one of the peach cookies Claire kept in the tin by the stove. She smiled, but it was the kind of smile that arrives late because the child is still deciding whether she is safe enough to use it. I watched her walk back to the car and climb into the back seat beside her mother, and I understood something. I should have understood sooner. Mason was not only trying to take a house. He was trying to train my family to accept his version of reality before I could name what was happening. That was never going to happen quietly anymore. By Sunday evening, Mason had settled into the house like a man who thought every chair belonged to him eventually. He arrived with a bottle of wine he knew I would not drink and a roast dinner he had not cooked. Claire took the bottle from him, set it on the counter, and did not say thank you. I noticed that. She had started to change in small ways, and those small ways mattered more than any speech. I asked Mason to sit at the table. He did. That was the surprise. Men who feel secure do not sit the moment they are asked. They hover. They pace. They perform ownership. Mason sat because he believed the day had already been won, and he wanted the table to feel like a signing room before it became one. I had spent the afternoon making the smallest possible changes. The binder was in the drawer beside me. My phone recorder was on. Daniel had told me not to confront Mason with everything at once. He said timing mattered. He said people under pressure tend to confess through patterns if you let them keep talking. So I let Mason talk. He said the roast had come from a place downtown. He said the buyer was eager. He said the doctor form would make things easier. He said Claire was exhausted from carrying too much. Each sentence was laid on the table like a polished stone, smooth enough to hide the rough edge underneath. Claire sat across from him with both hands wrapped around a glass of water she was not drinking. Lily ate quietly and watched all of us with the alert patience children use when adults are pretending the room is normal. At one point, Mason turned to me and said, "Frank, if we can finish the paperwork tomorrow, everybody avoids a lot of stress." I asked everybody. He gave that small smile again. You, Claire, Lily. Even me. There it was. Not concern, negotiation. He was selling convenience because he knew fear was not enough anymore. He was beginning to understand that I was not going to sign simply because he asked harder. So I changed the shape of the room. I slid the blank legal pad toward him and said, "Then write down exactly what you think must happen tomorrow." He froze for half a second. Claire looked at me sharply because she knew what I was doing. If Mason wrote it down, the lie had to become organized. Organized lies leave edges. Edges can be compared. He laughed lightly and took the pad anyway. "You want it in writing," he said. "I want clarity." He wrote slowly, and I watched his pen hesitate at the place where the buyer's name should have been. That hesitation was the crack. Mason's shoulders tightened when he noticed me watching. Then he scribbled something I could not yet read and slid the pad back, as if the speed of the movement could hide the fact that he had just exposed his own nerves. I did not look at the page right away. Instead, I looked at Claire. She had gone pale. She knew what I knew now. Whatever Mason had promised, he was no longer sure he could deliver it. Rosa Alvarez met me at the office the next morning before the phones had started ringing. That was another thing Margaret had left behind when she passed away, people who knew how to keep a promise without turning it into a performance. Rosa had been with us so long, she still called me boss when she was irritated and Frank when she was worried. That morning she did not waste either title. She held up a printout as soon as I walked in. "You were right to ask about the buyer," she said. "The name Mason used is tied to a shell company in Des Moines. Nothing clean about the timeline." I took the page from her and read it twice. The line that mattered most was not the buyer's name. It was the note on the margin Rosa had added in red title search request filed late after the first care draft, not before. Mason had not been building a plan around certainty. He had been building it around speed. Rosa poured coffee into 2 paper cups and set one in front of me. He also called asking about whether a temporary helper could access account statements if the owner was going through a rough patch. I looked up. He used those words. She nodded. "That is not concern," I said. "No," Rosa replied. "That is a script." The room got quiet after that. Rosa knew Claire well enough to understand the cost of being trapped in a clever man's urgency. She also knew I was not there to complain. I was there to make a clean map of the lie. She spread 3 items across the desk, a copy of the buyer email, the title search timing, and a message timestamp from Claire's phone, where Mason had asked for the draft to be ready by noon. I felt the shape of the whole thing finally come into focus. Not one move, a chain. Buyer pressure, doctor draft, account inquiry, title search. Each piece had been made to look ordinary when viewed alone. Together, they made a corridor Mason had been trying to walk us through, with the lights turned low. Rosa tapped the buyer email. "There is one more thing. Mason has been talking like the buyer is impatient, but the buyer has not paid anything yet. He is waiting on clean paperwork. That mattered. It meant Mason's leverage was smaller than he had let on. "Can you print everything I asked?" She already was. That was the practical step I needed most. Not because paper solves betrayal, because paper keeps betrayal from changing shape every time the liar gets nervous. When she handed me the folder, I put it beside the binder from Margaret and felt for the first time since Claire's text that I had more than fear in my hands. I had a path. And somewhere between Rose's office and my car, I realized Mason was probably on his way to the one place he thought nobody would question him. The doctor's office. Mason tried to turn a draft into a diagnosis. I found out because Claire called me from the parking lot outside the clinic, her voice shaking so hard I could hear her breath catch between words. "Dad, he asked me to come with him," she said. "He said he only needed me to confirm the form." I pulled the car over beside a row of bare winter trees and closed my eyes for 1 second. Not because I was surprised, because I was tired of being right about the worst parts. "Did you sign anything I asked?" No. I believed her instantly. Not because I trusted every part of the situation. Because the one thing Mason had not managed to do was make Claire careless enough to betray me with a pen in her hand. Daniel was already on speaker with us by the time I reached the clinic. He asked Claire to stay where she was and not let Mason move the conversation into any side room. He did not say the word danger. He did not need to. Claire heard the calm in his voice and understood that every minute Mason kept control depended on nobody naming what he was doing too soon. When I walked into the lobby, Mason was at the check-in desk with a clipped smile and the same folder I had seen on my table, only thinner now and missing the pages he no longer wanted anyone else to read. He saw me and stiffened. Then he recovered. "Frank," he said, "this is not the place." "That is funny," I said, "because it looks exactly like the place where you hope to make my life smaller." The receptionist's eyes darted between us. Claire stood near the chairs with her purse clutched in both hands. She looked ready to disappear through the floor if she could. Mason lowered his voice. "I was trying to help you." "No," I said. "You were trying to name my fear for me and call it kindness." He opened his mouth, then shut it again. That told me he had not prepared for language like that. He had prepared for confusion. He had prepared for a man who would get defensive, emotional, easy to dismiss. He had not prepared for a father who could see the shape of the lie without raising his voice. Daniel arrived 10 minutes later and asked to speak to the office staff in private. He did not need to say much. He only needed to ask whether the draft Mason brought in was the final version and whether anyone had verified that it belonged to me. The answer was no. Mason heard it. For the first time, his face went flat. Not angry, not smug, flat. That was worse, because flat meant he had started calculating exits. Claire stood up a little straighter when Daniel asked to see the paperwork again. It was the first time that day I saw her look less like a trapped daughter and more like a woman who had finally stopped agreeing to her own confusion. Mason glanced at her and something in his expression cracked, just for a blink. But I saw it. He was scared now, not of me, of losing the story he had spent weeks making sound inevitable. And once a man like Mason starts to fear inevitability slipping through his hands, he becomes dangerous in a different way. He becomes desperate. By Monday morning, the house looked too ordinary for the amount of trouble standing inside it. The light over the porch was still blue. The rain had cleared overnight, leaving the driveway clean and the air sharp enough to sting the inside of my nose. I stood in the front room with the binder under one arm and the title papers under the other, listening to the slow tick of the clock above the hallway mirror. Mason had chosen 10 o'clock for his return because he thought a clean hour would make the day feel official. He brought the buyer with him. That told me he was nervous. Men with full control do not arrive with backup. They arrive with confidence and paperwork. Mason arrived with a man in a wool coat and a briefcase and that too bright smile buyers wear when they believe the hard part has already been settled for them. Claire stayed in the doorway. Lily stood behind her, small and quiet, and watching everything. Mason began before anyone else could. "Frank, we can make this very simple. I looked at the buyer first. You must be the reason he is in such a hurry." The buyer hesitated. "I was told the title was ready." That one sentence changed the room. Mason turned toward him too quickly. "It is. We just need Frank's signature to finalize the transfer. I held up the title papers Rosa and Daniel had printed. Then let us talk about what the buyer was told, I said. The room went silent, except for the clock. I slid the trust addendum onto the table, then the bank inquiry notice, then the copied messages Claire had forwarded me. Each page landed with a small, clean sound, and each sound took a little more air out of Mason's confidence. The buyer's eyes moved from one page to the next. I watched the exact moment he realized this was not a simple family delay. It was a mismatch between what he thought he was buying and what Mason had promised him. Daniel arrived just after 10:15. He did not look rushed. That was part of the point. He introduced himself to the buyer, asked him to stay calm, and said, "Before anyone signs anything today, we need to be clear about what belongs to whom and what was drafted under pressure." Mason's mouth tightened. Pressure. Daniel's tone stayed polite. Yes, pressure. And there are messages, timing notes, and a title sequence that do not support your version of events. The buyer set his briefcase down slowly. That movement mattered more than anything Mason had said all morning. It meant the sale was no longer moving on Mason's speed. It was slowing down enough for truth to enter the room. Claire finally spoke. It was only one sentence, but it sounded like a door opening after years of being held shut. Mason told me Dad would get confused if I waited too long. He turned to her, and I saw the desperation at last. Not rage, not arrogance, fear. For the first time, I understood he had never really believed he was entitled to our trust. He had simply been racing the moment when we would notice he was not. And now that moment had arrived, sitting at my table in the blue light, with the buyer watching in silence, and my granddaughter gripping her mother's hand so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. There was nowhere left for Mason to hide. The buyer's name was Nolan Price, and the first thing I learned about him was that he did not like surprises. He stood beside my dining table with one hand resting on his briefcase, reading the trust addendum, while Daniel explained what the document meant in plain language. Daniel was careful. He did not dramatize. He did not turn the room into a courtroom. He simply laid the sequence out one step at a time. The property was not Mason's to promise. The trust had restrictions. The title review had been requested after the care draft appeared. The buyer had been told the family was unified when the family had not even been honestly informed. Nolan looked at Mason. "You told me your father-in-law wanted out of the property." Mason's face tightened. He did. He just gets sentimental. That sentence was the last straw for Claire. She lifted her head slowly, and I saw the moment she stopped trying to protect the version of her marriage Mason kept selling her. "No," she said. "Dad never said that." Mason looked at her like she had spoken out of turn in a room that belonged to him. But the room did not belong to him. The house did not belong to him. The story did not belong to him anymore either. Nolan put the addendum down. "I need to be very clear. I will not continue with a transaction if there is a question about authority." There it was. Not revenge, not spectacle. Consequence. Mason's shoulders rose and fell once. He tried to laugh, but the sound came out wrong. "This is a family misunderstanding." Daniel opened the folder Rosa had prepared and slid over the timeline. "Then the misunderstanding has dates, emails, account inquiries, and draft language that all point in the same direction." Nolan read the first page, then the second. I watched his expression move from impatience to caution. He was not there to save me. He was there to protect himself. That was fine. Sometimes the truth does not need a hero. It only needs the wrong person to realize the lie has become expensive. Mason reached for the folder, then stopped before touching it. Good. He was learning boundaries in real time. Claire moved closer to Lily, and Lily leaned into her side without looking away from the table. I hated that she was seeing any of this. But I also knew children notice the things adults hide. Maybe what she needed most was not a perfect family performance. Maybe she needed to see the truth could enter a room quietly and still change everything. Nolan closed his briefcase. "I am withdrawing until this is resolved," he said. Mason's mouth opened, then closed. The sale did not collapse with a shout. It ended with a latch clicking shut on a briefcase. That tiny sound was the cleanest answer Monday could have given us. But Mason was not finished. I could see it in the way he looked at Claire, as if she had stolen something from him by telling the truth. That look told me the next choice had to be hers. Claire did not speak right away after Nolan left. She stood beside Lily with one hand on the back of the chair and the other pressed against her own stomach, as if she were holding herself together from the inside. Mason watched her with a silence that had weight. I had seen that silence in him before. It was the silence he used after he did not get his way. The silence that made everyone else hurry to fix the mood before it hardened. But Claire did not hurry this time. She looked at me first, then Daniel, then Lily. Only then did she look at Mason. I saved the messages, she said. Mason's face changed so quickly, I almost missed the first version of it. Shock, then irritation, then something close to pleading. He had built his whole plan around Claire feeling too ashamed to show anyone how he talked when no one else was in the room. "Claire," he said softly, "do not do this in front of your father." That was the sentence that freed her, not because it was cruel, because it was familiar. She had heard some version of it too many times. Not here, not now, not in front of them, not when you are emotional, not when you are tired. Mason had spent years moving truth out of the room whenever it became inconvenient. Claire opened her phone. Her hands shook, but she did not stop. She showed Daniel the messages one by one. Mason asking whether the doctor draft was signed. Mason saying the buyer did not need to know about the trust restrictions. Mason saying I was old enough to be guided if everyone stayed consistent. Mason telling Claire that Lily should not hear conflicting stories about who managed the house. None of it looked like one grand confession. That was what made it worse. It looked like daily weather. Small pressure. Repeated pressure. The kind that slowly changes what a person thinks they are allowed to ask. Daniel asked Claire if she wanted the messages printed for the file. She looked at Mason one last time. He shook his head almost imperceptibly. For years, that might have been enough. Not that morning. "Yes," she said. The word was quiet, but it filled the room. Lily looked up at her mother. I will never forget that look. It was not relief exactly. It was recognition. A child watching the adult she loves choose the harder door and somehow make the room less frightening. Mason stepped back, as if the air had changed around him. "You are making me look like a monster," he said. Claire's voice trembled. "No, Mason. I am showing what you wrote." That was the cleanest sentence anyone had spoken all week. Mason had no answer for it, because evidence does not argue. It simply waits until the room is quiet enough to be seen. And for the first time since Blue Porch Light appeared on my phone, Claire was not hiding behind a code anymore. She was speaking in daylight. The review hearing 2 weeks later did not feel like victory. That may sound strange, because by then the buyer had withdrawn, the title issue had been frozen, and Daniel had filed enough documentation to make Mason's version of events look as thin as it had always been. But sitting in that small county room, with fluorescent lights humming above us, I did not feel triumphant. I felt old. Not weak, not confused. Old in the honest way. Old enough to understand that even when you win back control, you do not get back the days when your daughter was afraid to tell you the truth. You do not get back the ordinary dinners before every sentence had to be checked for hidden meaning. You do not get back the version of your family that existed before someone taught a child to question your mind for their convenience. Daniel had warned me not to expect drama. He was right. There was no grand speech, no sudden collapse, no perfect apology. The official asked questions, reviewed documents, confirmed that I was speaking clearly for myself, and noted the concerns around pressure and improper timing. Mason tried to sound wounded. He said he had been under financial strain. He said he had only wanted structure. He said families misunderstand one another when emotions run high. He did not say he was sorry to Lily. That told me more than any confession could have. Claire sat beside me, not beside him. Her hands were folded in her lap. She answered when she was asked. She did not make excuses for herself, and she did not decorate the truth to make it easier to swallow. She said Mason had pressured her. She said she had ignored doubts because she was afraid of what would happen if she stopped cooperating. She said the storm code was her way of reaching me when direct words felt unsafe. The room went still when she said that. I did not look at Mason. I looked at my daughter. She had not become fearless. That is not how healing works. She was scared and telling the truth anyway. That was stronger than any clean ending a person might imagine. When it was my turn, I kept my statement short. I said I wanted my documents protected. I said I wanted no rushed transfer. I said I wanted Lily shielded from adult pressure. And I said I was not asking for Mason to be ruined. I was asking for him to stop having access to the parts of my life he had treated like loose change. That was the line that made him look up. Maybe he expected bitterness. Maybe he expected revenge. Maybe he wanted me to sound cruel so he could point at me and say, "See." That is who Frank really is. I did not give him that. Daniel's folder closed softly at the end of the review. Claire exhaled beside me, and for the first time in weeks the sound did not seem borrowed from someone else. Outside, the courthouse steps were wet from morning rain. Claire stopped halfway down and said, "Dad, I do not know what happens now." I looked at her, then at Lily, waiting near Rosa's car with a blue ribbon tied around her backpack. "Neither do I said. "But this time we are not letting Mason decide what the question is." And that was the first honest beginning we had. The house did not feel safe again all at once. People like to imagine that once the truth comes out, the rooms become lighter, the air clears, and everyone knows where to stand. Real life is not that generous. The same table was still there, the same hallway, the same window where Lily had stood with Mason's note in her hand. The blue porch light still glowed at dusk, but now it carried two meanings. The old one Claire made as a child, and the new one we had survived as adults. Daniel helped me change what needed changing, not as a dramatic punishment, as housekeeping for the soul. Access rules, trustee contact instructions, written boundaries around who could request information, a note in the file that no transaction involving the house or trust would move without direct confirmation from me and Daniel. It was not glamorous. It did not look like the kind of justice people cheer for in stories. But every signed page felt like a hinge being tightened on a door that should never have been loose. Rosa came by with a folder of clean copies and a pie from the bakery Margaret used to love. Margaret would have color-coded this better, she said. For the first time in days, I laughed without feeling guilty. Claire started coming over on Wednesdays with Lily. At first she knocked, even though she still had a key. I noticed. She wanted permission where she had once assumed access. That mattered to me more than she knew. We did not pretend everything was fixed. The first few visits were awkward. Lily colored at the table, while Claire and I talked in careful pieces, as if our relationship were a cracked cup we were afraid to lift too quickly. Claire apologized more than once. I accepted the apology once and told her the rest would have to be built through choices. She nodded. That was enough for that day. Mason moved out of the house he and Claire had rented. I will not pretend I followed every detail of what happened to him after that. Daniel said some financial consequences were moving through the proper channels. Claire said he kept sending messages that began with soft words and ended with blame. She learned not to answer every emotional hook. I learned something too. Love without boundaries does not become stronger. It becomes easier to misuse. That sentence cost me more than I expected, because I had spent so much of my life confusing generosity with proof of love. I thought if I stayed open, the people I loved would know the door was safe. I forgot that a door can be safe and still need a lock. One evening, Lily asked if the blue porch light could stay up all year. Claire looked at me before answering. I said yes, not because we were still afraid, because sometimes a warning becomes a promise after the danger passes. And that night when I turned the switch on, the whole porch filled with blue light, and for once it did not feel like a signal for help. It felt like proof that we had finally learned how to come home honestly. The first real Sunday dinner after everything changed was almost too quiet. Claire brought mashed potatoes. Lily brought a drawing of the house with the porch light colored bright blue. Rosa brought cornbread and pretended she had not made enough for 6 people. Daniel stopped by only long enough to drop off one final envelope, then refused to stay because he said families need some meals without lawyers in them. He was right. We sat at the same table where Mason had tried to turn my life into paperwork. That could have made the room feel haunted, but it did not. Not exactly. It felt marked. Like a tree after a storm, still standing still, carrying the line where the wind had pressed hardest. Lily taped her drawing to the refrigerator. In it, I was on the porch. Claire was in the doorway. Lily had drawn herself between us, holding both our hands with arms stretched too long for her little body. Children do that in drawings. They make love bigger than anatomy, because they know what adults forget, sometimes reaching is the whole point. Claire stood beside me while I looked at it. "I should have told you sooner," she said. I nodded, yes. She flinched a little, but I did not soften the word. "Some truths are kind, because they are clear." Then I added, "And I should have taught you that needing help does not make you a burden." That was my part. Every family crisis has more than one lesson if you are honest enough to carry it. Mason made choices. Claire made choices. I made choices too. I had spent years making myself so available that my family sometimes forgot I was also a person with limits, fear, and the right to say no. We talked about Margaret that night. Not in the sad, careful way people talk about the dead. When they are afraid grief will spill over the edge of the table. We talked about her like she was still part of the rules of the house. Claire remembered the basement storms. Lily asked whether Grandma Margaret had really kept flashlights in 3 different drawers. I told her yes, and also batteries in places that made no sense until the lights went out. Claire smiled then. Her real one. Small, tired, but real. After dinner, Lily asked if Blue Porch Light still meant come quietly. I looked at Claire and she looked at me. Then I told Lily it means come honestly. She thought about that, then nodded, as if children understand clean language faster than adults do. Later, after they left, I stood alone on the porch while the blue light washed over the steps. The street was calm. No storm warning. No secret buyer. No folder waiting on the table. Just my house, my breath in the cold air, and the strange peace that comes after you stop confusing silence with safety. I did not get my old family back. Maybe that is not what healing means. Maybe healing means you stop begging the past to return and start building a house where the truth is allowed to sit at the table. I kept the binder. I kept the trust. I kept the porch light. Most importantly, I kept the boundary that let love stay love, instead of becoming a key someone else could use against me. And if your own daughter sent you an old family code one rainy night, then you heard someone planning to take your home by Monday. Would you confront them immediately, or would you do what I did and let the evidence speak first?